This is the fourth part of the interpretation of the psychology of money. Let's start. Should people do what they love, or should they do what is right? I feel that some people today have extremely extreme views on this issue, or, in other words, they imagine it very extremely. In their imagination, success requires hard work, struggle, and a bright future must be exchanged for with extreme efforts now. Does it mean that one must feel remorseful for not striving relentlessly and forfeit happiness just to avoid humility? I think this self-destructive struggle is not real struggle, it is self-indulgence, a self-numbing escape from reality, a reliance on miraculous powers, a reluctance to think, an illusionary belief. Of course, it is more likely the nonsense of those motivational mentors. From both theory and clinical experiments, whether you can excel in a skill does not necessarily depend on whether you love that skill. As long as your methods are correct, you practice deliberately, invest enough sweat and time, and persevere, you can reach a high level. That's why so many people can get into good universities even if they don't like studying. But you can't do this all the time. Persisting year after year in doing something you don't like, isn't that against human nature? Indeed, extraordinary achievements have some elements that go against human nature. It used to be said that people with aspirations should be tough on themselves, but there is a matter of degree. Everything should be done in moderation. Your model should not design life as two distinct parts, saying that the first half of my life is dedicated to struggle, and I can only enjoy life in the second half. That's imagination, no one really lives like that. When you consider the model of struggle, you should consider yourself as one of the variables. You cannot assume that you are a person without humanity. You cannot strategically go against your own nature. Let's continue talking about Morgan Housel's book, The Psychology of Money. Housel tells a few stories to illustrate the importance of human nature. Harry Markowitz is the pioneer of modern portfolio theory. If you have a large sum of money, how to design a portfolio to maximize expected returns and hedge risks, Markowitz studied this and won the Nobel Prize in economics for it. After Markowitz became famous for this theory, inevitably, people asked him about his own investment portfolio. Markowitz was very honest and said, "My approach is simple, half in stocks and half in bonds." You might think this is not quantitative enough, not scientific. Markowitz said, "I didn't think that much. If I didn't buy stocks and the stock market rose a lot, I would feel very regretful, and if I bought all stocks and the stock market fell a lot, I would feel very remorseful. My 50-50 investment strategy is not for anything else but to minimize my regrets and remorse." This is very common sense. It's not a rational investment strategy, but it's a reasonable one. Markowitz didn't have hundreds of millions of dollars to manage, he had just a small fortune, and the difference is not significant. There's no need to overthink. His inner satisfaction, whether he sleeps well at night, perhaps that psychological need is more important. The point is that happiness is not just about maximizing assets. Happiness also includes not doing things that make you feel strongly uncomfortable, satisfying your vanity, avoiding regrets as much as possible, having a clear sense of control over your life, most importantly. Of course, it's said that Markowitz later improved his personal asset management plan, perhaps because he had more money. But we appreciate his attitude of optimizing and stopping at a certain point. Here's another example. Is it good or bad when you have a fever after getting sick? We don't like having a fever, but having a fever is actually a good thing. Here's a story. Neurologist Julius Wagner-Jaureg, the 1927 Nobel Prize winner in physiology or medicine, won the award for using fever to treat diseases. At that time, there was a disease called neurosyphilis, where syphilis had infected the brain or spinal cord. In the era without antibiotics, this disease was essentially a death sentence. But Wagner-Jaureg made an observation. He found that patients with neurosyphilis, if they happened to get sick with another illness and had a fever, the neurosyphilis would often be cured because of that fever. Wagner-Jaureg speculated whether having a fever was beneficial for the body to fight viral infections. At the beginning of the 20th century, the requirements for human experiments were not as standardized as they are today, so Wagner-Jaureg could boldly use patients for experiments. His method was to inject other substances, such as typhoid, malaria, smallpox, etc., into patients to intentionally induce a fever, to see if neurosyphilis could be killed by this fever. His treatment was like adding another disease on top of the existing one, and some patients were directly killed by it. However, in the experiments, Wagner-Jaureg found that a mild form of malaria virus, which could cause a strong fever but was relatively controllable. As long as quinine was used, quinine is known to treat malaria, it could induce a fever in patients relatively safely. Wagner-Jaureg conducted controlled experiments, and the result was that using this malaria treatment, he could cure 60% of neurosyphilis patients out of every 10, while the control group could only cure 30%. He won the Nobel Prize with this discovery. But later, penicillin was invented, and his method became unnecessary. But this principle is crucial. Now we know that having a fever does enhance the immune system. Every 1 degree Fahrenheit increase in body temperature, equivalent to 5/9 degrees Celsius, can reduce the replication rate of certain viruses by 200 times. Children under 5 often have fevers, making parents very anxious. Some hospitals specifically tell parents on their websites, having a fever is a good thing for enhancing the immune system. If your child's fever is between 100 and 104 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 to 40 degrees Celsius, it's okay, no need to go to the hospital or take medicine. But there are few parents, or even few doctors, who would actually do that. It's hard for you to watch a child have a fever and not take care of them, because having a fever is uncomfortable. It's not the era without antibiotics anymore, so why use fever therapy? In Housel's words, using antipyretics is not entirely rational, but it is reasonable. We should do things that are reasonable, because you cannot persist in doing things that are unreasonable. For things like investment, being able to adhere to a strategy for the long term is more important than the specific strategy you use. From historical data, at least for the US stock market, if you only trade for 1 day, your probability of winning is only 50%. If you can invest for a year, your winning probability is 68%. If you can persist for 10 years, the winning probability rises to 88%. And if you invest for 20 years, your winning probability is almost 100%. Buffett's secret is staying alive. If you want to invest, you have to persevere. It's better to use a flawed but sustainable strategy than to choose an absolutely rational but unsustainable strategy. In 2008, 2 researchers at Yale University published a report proposing an extreme investment strategy. Their guiding idea was that when you are young, you should be adventurous, and as you get older, you should gradually reduce risk and become more stable. This idea is fine. The question is, how adventurous should you be when you are young? The report suggested that you should use a 2-to-1 ratio, financing to buy stocks. In other words, if you can come up with $1, you should borrow $2 from an institution, for a total investment of $3. What is the concept of leverage? As long as the market rises by 1/3, your net worth doubles, but as long as the market falls by 1/3, you lose everything. The Yale report said that as long as you are young, even if you experience bankruptcy a few times, you should resolutely use this strategy and then gradually reduce leverage over the long course of life. As long as you can persist, this strategy can maximize your investment returns. This is completely in line with mathematics. But Housel says this is not a mathematical problem. How many people will continue to use the same strategy when their accounts are cleared? Can you convince yourself? Can you emotionally accept it? You can't. As long as you consider yourself as a variable, taking into account that you are not an automatic machine, your financial model needs psychology. Persistence requires patience, and patience requires love. If you don't have love for something and persist solely for profit, it might perform well at times, but if there are any setbacks, you won't be able to persist. With love, you can persist even when it doesn't perform well in the short term. Your investment career can only persist with love. That's why happy people are not those who are only happy after amassing wealth, they are those who are happy every day, regardless of their wealth. This is why we must get married for love. Considering human nature, some seemingly irrational behaviors are actually reasonable. For example, investors have a home bias, and people always love to buy stocks from their own country. In theory, money is money. Why do you have to invest in Chinese stocks if you are Chinese? In reality, many Chinese people also love to buy Chinese concept stocks in the US stock market. Are you here to make money or to show patriotism? But this is actually reasonable. Maybe you are more familiar with Chinese companies, more willing to research them, and therefore more willing to hold them. For example, rational individual retail investors should strongly avoid high-frequency operations like day trading because you will inevitably lose more than you win. But if you just like buying and selling stocks, set aside a small amount of money specifically for high-frequency trading, satisfy your hobby, protect your main investment, that's fine. The Vanguard Group, one of the largest fund management companies in the United States, deceased CEO John Bogle has always advocated for buying index funds throughout his career, especially not recommending individuals to pick stocks themselves, and opposing hedge fund companies that charge high management fees. But his son is a manager of a hedge fund. And John Bogle invested some money into his son. People asked Bogle, "You always advocate for buying index funds, why do you invest money in a hedge fund, which contradicts your philosophy?" Bogle said, "It doesn't match my philosophy, but why can't I invest a little money for family reasons?" The point of this video is that people should not lose their humanity for the sake of so-called rationality. Emotions and hobbies are our important standpoints, the starting point for our scientific thinking, not something scientific thinking should avoid. We live not just to maximize financial returns. One of the most important purposes of living is to be happy, to satisfy our preferences. Considering yourself as a variable, treating your emotions and hobbies as optimization indicators, we will live a more spiritual, more interesting, and more meaningful life. Delaying satisfaction is not about avoiding it, postponing pleasure is not about delaying it for years. Happy people have never been happy only after making enough money. Heroes not only dare to endure hardships, but also dare to be happy. The future you will surely thank the present you for preserving your beautiful human nature.
If you feel there is value in this, please like, subscribe to this channel, and leave your thoughts or suggestions in the comments section. Let's grow together and read more good books.